All right, so before we get started, I guess, I want you to just think about like what is a long-term goal that you have for yourself. Something that you like want to accomplish. Does anybody want to share a long-term goal you have? I'd say, first of all, it's probably pretty obvious everyone in here would like to get a degree of some kind because you're here in a college classroom. So let's maybe not say that one. Does anybody have any other goal that you're working towards?
Buying a house.
Buying a house, there you go. Okay, so you want to buy a house. Anybody else have a goal to maybe one day buy a house? Okay. Why do you have that goal? What is it about buying a house that you think makes you want that? Yeah.
You'll have your own place and shelter.
Yeah, okay, so you'll have something that's your own and it's shelter. I would say those are two kind of different things, right? Why is it important to have something of your own?
You can customize it, decorate it. Nobody can ever tell you it's not yours.
Yeah.
It's yours.
Yeah, did you have something else to
I was just gonna say, you don't have to pay rent.
You do still have to pay a mortgage unless you're rich enough that you can just buy a house with cash.
Goes towards your house.
Yeah, yes, I agree. Yeah, that's definitely a plus. So I think some of the things you guys are getting at is one, like a sense of autonomy or like control. Like I have control over my own house, my own life. I can make the decisions I want. No one's making a decision for me. Agatha mentioned shelter, so there's like this survival instinct, right? We obviously need somewhere to live, to have shelter to protect us from rain and storm and etc. So all of those things are different motivators, right? We have motivators that are very internal, that sense of autonomy of wanting something for ourselves to have control. And then we also have things that are more external. So things like, shelter. I'm glad none of you said it, but maybe you want a house for kind of the status or the prestige, right? It's a higher status if you own a house compared to renting. So maybe that's something that's important to some of you. That would be more of an external motivator, which we'll talk about in just a second. So motivation, as is probably obvious from that example and any example, is determined by a lot of different factors. So there's internal and external factors. We have universal needs, things that everybody needs. Evolution is a huge contributor to our motivation. So we have evolved to be motivated towards specific things because those things in the past have helped us to survive and to reproduce and have offspring that then have the similar desires. It's also determined a little bit by our overall level of, I'm using the word arousal here in very broad terms, like our alertness, our state of awakeness and engagement. Disordered motivation can result in things like addiction and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So we're going to talk at the end about some of those kind of disruptions in motivation and how they occur and the effects that they can have. So first, I already alluded to this quite a bit, that there's this difference between what's called intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation are motivators that come from, internally, from our own internal desires. So these would be things like autonomy, for example. So wanting to have your own house because you want to have control and make your own decisions for yourself. Maybe you want a particular job so that you can have financial independence. So you don't have to depend on your parents or your caregivers, so you can, again, make choices for yourself. So autonomy is a very powerful intrinsic motivator. Things like mastery. Maybe you just want to be really good at something. Maybe you want to have a house so that you can work on the floors and you can master doing, woodworking projects or things like that. Having a sense of purpose is another very strong intrinsic motivator. But again, the thing that all of these have in common is that they're coming from within. They're an internal motivator. In addition to that, we're often motivated by things that are external to us or extrinsic motivators. These are often, in the form of rewards or punishments or compensation. So money is one of them, right? So you mentioned you don't want to pay rent. Part of that, I would say, is driven by autonomy. Again, you want to have control of your own finances. You want to control where that money's going. But you also want more money. I think all of us would agree with that, right? And so if you're putting money towards a mortgage, overall, across your whole lifespan, you're going to end up with more money than if you're just throwing that into rent that you don't ever get any kind of, compensation back from. A lot of you might be trying to get a degree so that you can get a job that pays more. So again, that would be, that payment, that money would be an extrinsic motivator because it's something that's coming from outside. Other people's perceptions of us is another external motivator. So again, if you want to buy a house for like that status or that prestige, that would be an external motivator. If you want to get a degree because of that status and prestige, that would also be an external motivator. Some people, so we all, to some extent, are motivated by both of these things, right? And oftentimes our decisions are a complex mix of all these motivations. So again, you might want to buy a house for all the reasons that I just said, not for one particular reason, so there's a mix of intrinsic and extrinsic motivators. But in general, people tend to gravitate towards one of these more than the other. So some people are more strongly intrinsically motivated, some people are more strongly extrinsically motivated. And a lot of that just depends on background, upbringing, etc. We also all have universal needs that we are constantly striving for that motivate a lot of our behavior as well. One of the most common ways of kind of conceptualizing these needs is what's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So Maslow is a sort of humanist psychologist who developed a lot of different theories, but probably his most famous one is this idea of this hierarchy of needs. And basically, according to Maslow, there's this hierarchy where there's these foundational things that we absolutely need basically to just survive. So at the foundation of this hierarchy are physiological needs. So that would be things like food, water, shelter, and warmth. And we want a house because we need shelter. That's, one of the most basic motivators of our desires. Then the next level up is security. So once we have obtained that physiological need, then we move on to try to strive for a little bit more security, safety, stability, having employment so that we have a consistent income coming in, having assets that we can sell if something, some sort of emergency happens. Those would all be considered in this security layer. Then on top of that, we have these social needs. So all of us have a strong desire to have some kind of social bond. That could be either with families, friends. It could be through intimate romantic relationships. But we all have this need for belonging. Fourth layer is esteem. So having a sense of self-worth, feeling valuable, feeling like we've made accomplishments, and having confidence. And then at the very peak of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is what he called self-actualization. So that's kind of like the icing on the cake. That's getting to the point where we have full inner fulfillment. We're doing pretty much everything we want to do. So a couple things to note about Maslow's hierarchy. So one is that originally whenever Maslow proposed this, he suggested that we work through these needs kind of in order, starting from the bottom and going up. So he originally proposed, for example, that if you do not have your physiological needs met, then nothing else really matters. You're going to be striving for survival, and you're going to ignore everything else. And that you need to have this foundation in place before you can move through the next layers or the next steps. So that was kind of how he originally proposed it. There are some researchers who have kind of pushed back against that idea, and there's some debate about it, because that would suggest basically that someone who, for example, doesn't have shelter, so someone who's experiencing homelessness, doesn't care about intimacy or friendship, which seems to not be the case at all. So even people who are experiencing homelessness still want a social connection, they still want inner fulfillment, and they're still striving for those things, even though they maybe currently do not have shelter. So that idea that you work through these in order is probably not correct, but it is probably correct that this is highest priority. So if you don't have shelter, that's probably going to be the focus at least until you acquire shelter. That's going to be the highest priority basically. Okay, but again, the idea is that all of these things listed here are very strong motivators for a lot of the goals that we pursue, for a lot of the desires that we have. In addition to, internal factors, external factors, all these universal needs that everyone experiences, we are also driven and motivated quite a bit by our evolution as a species and the evolution that we have gone through to get to the point we are now. I don't think, have we ever talked about evolutionary psychology in this class? We talked about it in other classes before, but I don't think we have here, so. I think I maybe might have mentioned it on like day 1 or something when I was just quickly going through different areas of psychology, but that's probably it. So the idea of evolutionary psychology is basically that our brains are organs just like any other part of our body, and they have evolved just like any other part of our body, and that our brains drive most of our behavior and our desires and our thoughts, and so therefore our behaviors and desires and thoughts have evolved just like anything else, which if you've never heard that idea before might be kind of a little hard to wrap your head around. But just a couple important things about evolutionary psychology since we've never talked about it. One is that evolutionary psychologists emphasize that most of the evolution that humans did occurred roughly like between 200,000 and 2 million years ago. So somewhere in that timeline, humans for the most part would have been settled in like Africa, and we would have had a very sort of nomadic hunter-gatherer kind of lifestyle. So people would have lived at that time in tribes of like 100 or so, like between 100 and 150. And we would have spent most of our time going out hunting animals to get food and then gathering, like foraging for, fruits and things like that. And that basically after that point in time, after about 20,000 years ago, we haven't really, evolution takes place over a very long period of time, especially for a species as complex as humans. And so we haven't really evolved much since 20,000 years ago, okay, according to evolutionary psychologists. Our environment, though, has changed pretty drastically, mostly because of, changes we have made to the environment. So we've gone through industry and everything, building, technology, etc. And so there is kind of this mismatch between what our brains evolved to and what we are currently living in. Does that make some sense a little bit? Okay. So part of the idea is that our motivations then are driven by all that evolution. So anything that would have benefited us 20,000 years ago in that nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle, that is what motivates a lot of our behaviors, even in modern times where we don't live in that environment anymore. So this can explain things like what motivates our food choices, for example. So let's say, hypothetically, let's say you could eat anything you wanted, and it was not going to have any kind of negative impact on your health. It's not going to change your weight in any negative way. It's not going to cause diabetes or obesity or anything. You could eat whatever you want. What foods would you guys eat? Junk food, okay. Be more specific, maybe. We all might have a slightly different idea. I think something over here. Fried food, okay. What else? Ice cream. Pizza, okay. I know for me, for sure, it'd be like chocolate and sweet things, like major sugar addiction, so I would just eat all the desserts all the time. How many of you would, in that condition, eat, lettuce and, kale and stuff? I might occasionally, but probably not most of the time, right? Which is kind of weird if you think about it, right? We have evolved to have these very specific food preferences. We all like things that are salty, sweet, fatty, even though in our modern environment that is very terrible for us, okay? So I want you to kind of put on a evolutionary psychologist hat. Why do you think that would be? Why would we have evolved to desire these foods that ultimately do lead to things like obesity and diabetes and heart disease, etc.? Yeah.
Because I forgot. I had something for the.
That's okay. It happens. So try to think of our environment 20,000 years ago, or 2 million years ago in Central Africa. Yeah, Aiden.
Because they all have high glucose levels.
Yeah. So all the foods I just named, they have high levels of energy, I would say. So sugar, lots of glucose, which is important for energizing all the cells in our body. Fats, there's a lot of different fats, but the same idea, right? Fats store a massive amount of energy. So if you think about 20,000 to 2 million years ago, the chances that I would come across something that has a high amount of sugar or a high amount of fat, first of all, is very low. It's very unlikely I'm going to find something like that because in sort of the natural world in South Africa, there's going to be you know, maybe some fruits and berries and things that have some sugar, but other than that, it's going to be mostly protein-based animals that I'm consuming for the most part. So to come across a piece of fruit in Africa is going to be a rare thing. And when it happens, I'm going to want to eat as much of that fruit as I can, because probably I'm mostly starving at that point in time, right? 20,000, 2 million years ago, it would have been difficult to find food and hunt it down and to have like a steady supply of it. So if I come across something that's rich in calories, I'm going to want to eat as much as I can, so I have lots of energy, so I can go, you know, chase down a, I don't know, lion or whatever that I'm hunting that day, right? So in that context, eating sugary, fatty foods anytime I come across it makes a lot of sense and is going to help me survive and have offspring, etc. But now you take that brain that evolved with that mechanism, with that motivation, and you put it in today's society where I can go to Walmart and the sugary, fatty things are going to be ultra-processed, high-calorie things, and I'm going to be able to eat a ton of those, and then I'm just going to sit in my office and be on my computer for 8 hours straight. That's not healthy, right? But we still have the same brain that we evolved to have, so it's difficult to like overcome those food choices. So similar thing with fears. So any of you have any like phobias? Anything you're scared of? Like if you saw that thing, you would be scared. How many of you are afraid of spiders, for example? Okay, what about snakes? All right, anybody scared of heights? Okay, what about like flying in a plane? About enclosed spaces? Okay, so we've got quite a few like spiders and snakes, you know, all those things I just listed off are probably some of the most common phobias. Have any others I didn't name that you want to share? Okay. How many of you know anyone who has died of any of those things I just named? Snake bite, spider bite, plane crash. Again, kind of weird we have like these phobias of those things, right? When in reality they don't pose much of a danger. Okay, how many of you have a phobia of cardiovascular disease? How many of you have a phobia of car accident? Right? Those are amazing. I mean, COVID might have overcame those in the past however many years, but in general, those tend to be the top 2 causes of death in the United States, cardiovascular disease and car accidents, yet no one has a phobia of those, right? So again, with your evolutionary psychologist hat, why do you think that would be the case? Why do we have phobias for snakes and spiders, but not cardiovascular disease and car accidents? Yeah.
Because they're like dangers we would have faced out in the wild, and we never like had cars back then to be afraid of.
Exactly, yeah. So at the point in time that our brains were evolving, cars did not exist, so there's no way we could have evolved a phobia of those. Cardiovascular disease wouldn't have even really existed either, because again, the chances that we have such a vast supply of food that we're gaining large amounts of weight and we're, you know, ingesting lots of salt that's driving up our cholesterol, all the things that cause cardiovascular disease would not have been happening 20,000 years ago. So no one's going to evolve a phobia of that. But if I'm out hunting and gathering, I might encounter a snake. And if I get bit by a snake 20,000 years ago, I'm probably going to die if it's a venomous snake. I might encounter a spider as I'm rolling over a log or whatever to get my mushrooms. Maybe a spider bites me. Again, if it's venomous and I get a spider bite 20,000 years ago, probably going to die from that, right? So it makes sense that we would have evolved fears for those things, but not for modern threats and dangers. Okay, we talk about mate selection. I don't know how long I want to spend on this because this gets a little more controversial, a little more dicey. But maybe, let's see, we're at 10 o'clock. Sure, we still have plenty of time. Okay, so for this one, I want you, when I get into small groups, maybe like 3 or 4, and there's 2 ways you can approach this just depending on how personal you want to get with people that you might barely know at this point. One approach, you can talk about what you personally look for in a mate, you know, whatever that might be. If that's maybe a little too vulnerable, maybe try to think of like a celebrity couple that you know of. And for that celebrity couple, talk about what they see in each other. Does that make sense? So like why they would have paired up with each other. Okay? So in groups of 3 or 4, I want you to just talk briefly about that. Okay, which one do you guys want to do? The celebrity one or the Yeah, that's a good try. Acts, probably. Not, I mean, it doesn't have to be like a 5-star athlete, or like, you know, just. Yeah. That's just someone I'm not with. That's someone that's not even on my radar.
Somebody likes to
Oh, MGK and Megan Fox drink each other's blood. That's amazing.
Didn't they break up?
I think so. She like unfollowed him, then followed him, and then really through Instagram. So.
That'd be
I would say high school.
What did they see? Megan Fox and MGK.
Yeah.
Megan Fox loves her husband and 2 kids with a 20-year-old. So.
Hey, maybe another minute or two.
Come back as a whole group. Someone that cares about friends. They don't have to like them a lot, but they just need to be able to care a little bit.
It's not, it's like,
All right, you all got quiet, so I'll take that as an opportunity. Okay, so anybody want to share what you came up with? Yeah.
We said somebody who's responsible, and then we also said like strong.
Okay. Okay. What else? Yeah.
So, we said healthy,
Okay.
and it's kind of this out there, but also physical.
Yes. Physically attractive.
Yeah.
Okay. We can be, I would say, let's be appropriate, obviously, but we can also be honest and blunt and straightforward. You don't have to pretend like this is not an important thing. Yeah.
We said good work ethic.
Good work ethic, okay.
Motivated.
Motivated. Okay. Any others? Yeah. Ian.
Financial or social security.
Social social, I'm gonna put maybe social status. When I say social security, I think of like the payments that old people get. Yeah.
I was like, what?
Did you have another one, Isaac?
Yeah, personality.
Personality, okay. Alright, that's a pretty good list so far. Let's kind of break down some of these though. How would you know if someone's strong or not? So let's say like you're out dating, you're swiping through Tinder or whatever you guys do in your generation. How do you know if someone's strong or not?
Muscles. They're physically fit.
Okay, so muscles, physical fitness. And I'm just gonna say I noticed that it's mostly girls, I assume girls at least, saying this one. Okay. Alright, how would you know if someone's healthy? Again, if you're just
Fit.
kind of same thing, right? Fitness. Do you have anything different, Eden? You? Yeah? Camry?
I think that like, almost like if somebody looks like clean.
Okay, clean.
Yeah.
Okay. Aiden?
Fat levels.
Okay. I think that ties in with fitness. Is it okay that we include that in fitness, but I know what you mean. Yes? Like body composition, maybe?
Sure.
Okay. Alright. Okay, can we maybe also, we're already doing this a little bit, but can we break down physically attractive just a little bit? Like, what do we mean when we say that?
I said I like all.
So height. I need to maybe start using different colors for, let's see. There's girls who said this. This was more of a male response, not that one though. Okay. What else? In addition to height, what else might determine physical attractiveness?
Yeah, nice teeth.
Teeth. Okay. Features. That's very vague. I love how you guys are just like, yeah. Lizzie.
This might be weird, but like if they're not.
Kindness.
It's like you're not attractive if you're not kind.
Yeah, I'll put that with personality. Okay. I've heard a lot from females. Any males want to share what they mean when they say physically attractive?
Eyes.
Okay. All right. I'll say it for you guys. 'Cause, I'm gonna say breast size, hip size. Does anyone disagree?
No.
Okay. 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 Let's see. I want to let's mark off some of the things that like probably everyone looks for, regardless of your gender or your sexual orientation. So probably everyone wants someone who's responsible, right? Whether you're male looking for female, male looking for male, etc. I'm gonna kind of skip around. We can debate about others. Probably everybody wants someone with a good work ethic, I would guess. Probably. Probably everyone wants someone who's motivated. Probably everybody would prefer someone who's good social status and who's kind. I'll say based on at least evidence, I don't know about your guys' personal opinions, but there's some pretty good evidence that financial security is more important for a woman looking for a man. So when a woman is pursuing a man and dating, she may look for someone who has signs that they are financially stable. Okay, so we'll put this in the female category.
Can I disagree with that?
Yeah.
Sure, yes. Yeah.
Just because, like, if I were a guy, then to see a woman who was independent and, like, had her own money and, like, you know, did her own stuff and, like, wasn't really, like, just like, oh, pick me or, like, whatever, like, that would be more attractive to me. So I disagree that that's a
I know some
women
guys
has
that
something.
won't date. That's true, but some men also see it as a threat if you're
Oh, yeah.
financially
Definitely.
stronger than them, physically stronger than them,
Then they
mentally
have,
stronger
yeah,
than them.
right, I agree.
Yeah, so I agree with both points that have been made. There are certainly people who are going to pursue someone who's financially stable, you know, males who are going to look for girls financially stable. There also definitely are males who are very threatened by someone else who has financial status that they don't. So those are both true. So I'm saying based on large surveys and polls and data that comes from, you know, thousands of people basically, that this tends to be true. So like for the average general, okay? Does that make sense? Especially historically. I will say this conversation always gets trickier every year because a lot of these things change with social and culture things, and your generation's culture of dating is very different from previous generations of, you know, dating. So what you guys value might be very different from what has historically been the norm, which is, in my opinion, mostly a good thing. So, yeah, okay. I will say also, just based on kind of the discussion, a lot of the things about physical attractiveness were coming from females, but a lot of them, so height, there's a female who said that, which I think, you know, in general, women tend to look for men who are tall, men tend to look for women who are at least shorter than them, not necessarily short, but shorter than they are, okay? Teeth, I'd say probably everybody cares about that. Everybody probably cares a little bit about features and eyes in general. Maybe obviously someone who's pursuing a female is going to care about breast size and hip size, whether that's a male or like, you know, lesbian female or whatever. So I would say those are things that males are looking for more than females. Muscles, females are looking for more than males. Okay, everybody following me kind of with what I'm getting at here? So in general, from all of this, according to evolutionary psychologists at least, in general, men do tend to look for females that, you know, have a particular physical attractiveness. Breast size, hip size is important. You guys didn't say much about, like, you said features and eyes and teeth, but in general, kind of what everybody looks for is a face that's symmetrical, that's free of blemishes in general. All of that would indicate maybe cleanliness or fitness. Women, like I said, tend to focus more on financial security. Women also tend to focus a little more on personality factors, things like kindness, ambition, drive, motivation, etc. So those, again, just in general, tend to be true if you poll like thousands of people. All right. So going back to evolutionary psychology, the main point I'm trying to make is there seems to be some gender differences in what people look for in a mate. Okay. And I will also clarify, just to make it a little easier to talk about, I guess, we're mostly talking here about heterosexual couples. There's unfortunately not a lot of research from a perspective of evolutionary psychology on, you know, like homosexual or bisexual people. So we're focusing mostly on heterosexual cisgender people in this discussion. Again, males tend to look for things that are physically based, physical attractiveness. Women tend to look for more personality factors, things like ambition, drive, financial security, etc. And this one, I'll just tell you guys what evolutionary psychologists think instead of trying to make you guess, because it's a little more complex. So according to evolutionary psychologists, there's 3 just basic facts of relationships that drive a lot of these differences. One fact is that women by nature, cisgendered women by nature, tend to be more invested in their offspring than men, because we have to carry the offspring for 9 months in our stomach and make every single choice during that 9 months about what we're going to put in our bodies and what we're going to do and how that's going to affect the offspring, whereas men don't have to do that. Okay, just basic fact of life. The second fact, which this didn't come up in this discussion, but I'll talk about it in just a second, is that women, especially in evolutionary times, could be 100% certain of that their child is their child, whereas men did not have that certainty until we invented like paternity tests, which would have been, I don't know, maybe in the past 100 years or something, right? So in evolutionary times, men could not be certain that their children, or their offspring were their own, because women could be unfaithful and you would never know, right? And then the third important thing is that there's pretty good evidence that female fertility declines more rapidly and drastically than male fertility does. So for females in general, again, historically, around 35, fertility pretty sharply declines, goes downhill. If you get pregnant and have a child after 35, there's a much higher chance that they're going to have like mutations and disabilities, things like that. And it's going to be increasingly harder to even get pregnant as you get older as a woman. For men, fertility doesn't decline quite as drastically or sharply. They do have some decline, but it's much more gradual and starts a little later. So for males, decline in fertility might start around like 45 or 50, and it's this more like sloped, gradual decline, whereas for women, it's like pretty sharp. Okay? Those are just basic facts of nature. So according to evolutionary psychologists, all these differences that we have in preferences for mates, gender differences we have, come from those three facts. So men are basically looking for someone who is fit and healthy enough that they are going to be able to carry the offspring, but they don't necessarily care as much about the other things like financial status and personality, because it's like, once the woman's pregnant and has the baby, I've passed my genes, I've had my offspring, I can kind of move on. Again, historically, evolutionary times, that would have often been true. So they look for things that indicate fertility in women. So youth is very important because, again, as women get older, their fertility drastically declines. So men are often looking for indicators of youth. So that would be things like, fitness, cleanliness, also just like energy level, but they're also looking for someone who has good genes that they can pair with. So someone who is physically fit, etc. There's some evidence that one of the best indicators of female fertility is what's called the waist to hip ratio. So how wide your waist is compared to your hips. And that's driven a lot by like the amount of estrogen in a woman's body. So there's some relationship between like that ratio and how fertile a woman is likely to be. So that might be part of the reason that hip size and even like breast size is kind of similar. Like, larger breasts tend to indicate more high levels of estrogen, which is higher fertility, higher likelihood that this woman will get pregnant if I mate with her. So that's why those tend to be important for males. For females, because they're so invested in the offspring, they want a mate who is also going to be committed and invested in that offspring as well. So they want someone who has personality factors like kindness, who's going to share their resources. They also want a mate who has a lot of resources that they can share, which in modern times equates to financial security, right? In evolutionary past, that might have been more like, I want a mate who has shelter, who has access to food, etc., and who is willing to share those things with me. Males also tend to care a lot more about physical fidelity or faithfulness. So they prefer to have a woman who will only sleep with them and no one else. And again, that relates back to that third point that men historically could not have been 100% certain who their offspring actually belonged to. If there's any evidence that their mate might have cheated on them or been unfaithful, then that would have been a really a breach of their trust and caused a lot of issues. Whereas women tend to care more about what's called emotional fidelity. So women tend to not care as much if their spouse physically cheats on them, but if their spouse is showing signs that they're very emotionally invested in another woman, then that can be very distressing, because then that man might leave and take the resources with him, and then she's left to raise the child by herself, which again, historically and evolutionary times would have been extremely difficult. Okay? Does that all make sense? It's not great. I don't love it, but it's kind of the truth of, evolution and the way we evolved. There is, though, some evidence. So oftentimes evolutionary psychologists, one of the pieces of evidence that they use to kind of support the idea that something evolved is that it's universal across cultures, which a lot of what I just described is not universal across cultures, and it seems to change from generation to generation. So I think probably the best way to interpret all of this is that, evolution played a really big part in our mate preference, but that it is something that is so social, like choosing a mate is such a social thing, that of course it's going to be determined by society and culture. So the culture that you live in is going to change a lot of that. So there's evidence that cultures that are more have more equality between genders, like women get paid the same amount as men, for example. That's one measure of equality. So countries where that's more true, you tend to see a lot less of these gender differences. And in countries where it's more true, where women have less equality, then these differences become more extreme. So there's some role of evolution, but there's also a lot of cultural influence on our mate selection as well. Okay, all of that though, that's a very lengthy way to say that another thing that can determine our motivations is the way that we have evolved over the course of several millennia, basically. So far we've talked about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. We talked about things like universal needs. We talked about the role that evolution can have. Another thing that can determine our motivation to engage in something and then also determine how well we perform on that task is our overall level of arousal, which I know after talking about all of that, you guys probably have a very different idea of what I mean by arousal. Again, by arousal, I just mean like overall level of alertness or awakeness or awareness. That's what we're talking about. So there's some evidence that different states of arousal can contribute differently to our motivation and our performance. And there's kind of this like sweet spot level of arousal that we need to be in to be properly motivated and engaged with a task. So if, like let's say for example, you have an exam coming up in your next class today. If you like are half asleep while you're taking that exam, like you can't even keep your eyes open, you're probably not going to do great, right? But if you're like super, super anxious and your heart is just beating like 100 beats per second and like you're terrified, you're obviously probably not going to do very well in the exam either. So you want to be in kind of this sweet spot level of arousal. You want to be awake, alert, engaged with the exam, but you don't want to be in the level of like anxiety or freaking out, right? So there's kind of this optimal level of arousal that we need to be in to be motivated to do well on any task. To complicate things a little bit more, there's something called the Yerkes-Dodson law, which that's just named after the researchers who discovered this and like put it all together mathematically. That basically says that easy tasks tend to benefit from higher levels of arousal, and difficult tasks tend to benefit from lower levels of arousal. So for easy tasks, that optimal level is higher than it is for difficult tasks. So let me tell you about a couple studies that support this idea, just as examples of what I mean. So there was one study where they had participants doing this task that was like super easy to the point of being really boring and tedious, where basically they were like seated in front of a computer and there would be shapes that would flash at them, and every time there was a square, for example, they're supposed to push one button, and every time there's a circle, they're supposed to push another button. So very easy task, just identifying squares or circles. What they did though is they broke their participants into different groups that got different levels of caffeine. So we all know caffeine raises our alertness or our arousal level. So some people got, no caffeine. Some of them got, like 100 milligrams. Some of them got 200 milligrams, etc. And then they did this shape task. And what they found is the ones that got more caffeine, they were faster and more accurate at this very easy shape sorting task. So in that case, having higher levels of arousal was a benefit because this is a very easy task. There was another study where the task that they were doing was shooting baskets, like a free-range basketball goal, or free throw, right? Is that what it's called? The line? I just blanked. I don't know sports good. The line that you stand at and you shoot the ball. They were doing that, free throw. And in one condition, they had low arousal, where basically they were just like messing around. They're shooting the ball. There's no one watching them. There's no stakes involved. They're just like messing around trying to shoot the ball. In the difficult or the high arousal condition, they were doing the same thing, shooting free throws, but they did it to where there was like an audience in the stand watching them. There was cameras and lights recording them. They also had it to where, like, I'm trying to remember exactly how they set it up. They basically got paid for every shot that they made, every basket that they made. There was some like formula they used to figure out how much they paid, but that doesn't really matter. The point is they get paid, so like there's stakes attached to it. What they found is that they performed better when they were in that low pressure, low arousal state where they're just like messing around shooting free throws, and they performed worse in the higher arousal level. So all this is to say, in general, easy tasks benefit from high arousal, difficult tasks benefit from lower levels of arousal. Is there anything else I wanted to say about this? In addition to driving like our performance and our motivation level, level of arousal also affects our preferences for things like music and humor and like poetry and art, and it kind of follows the same principle. So media that evokes kind of this optimal mid-level of arousal is often preferred over something that causes really low or really high levels of arousal. And again, that all kind of relates to like boredom and anxiety. Like if you listen to a piece of music and it's overly simple and boring, then that's going to cause a low state of arousal. You're probably not going to really like it. If it's something that's like really high intensity, high energy, and it's making you feel anxious, you're probably not going to like that either. So you look for things that kind of hit like this sweet spot, basically. And I have actually an example to demonstrate this. I don't know what my volume level's at. Does somebody want to actually shut the door just so we're not disturbing the other classes? So I have two different pieces of music here that I'm going to play. I'm going to play, I don't know, maybe 30 seconds or so of each one. And I want you to just listen to them, and then at the end I'm going to have you vote on which one you like better. I don't know what my volume level's at, so it might take me a second to get adjusted, but here is song number 1. Give me 1 second to figure out my volume. Sorry, I don't know why that's not working. There we go. Okay. So here's song number 1. Can everybody hear that good?
We clawed, we chained our hearts in vain. We jumped, never asking why. We kissed, I fell under your spell of love no one could deny. Don't you ever say I just walked away. I will always want you. I can't live a life running for my life. I will always want you. I came in like a wrecking ball. I never hit so hard in love. All I wanted was to break your walls. All you ever did was wreck me. Yeah, you wreck me.
Okay, that was song number 1. Here is song number 2. So those were your 2 options. First of all, had anybody ever heard those songs before? Obviously the first one was like a cover of Wrecking Ball, but have you ever heard that specific version or the second song? Okay. All right. So how many of you prefer song number 1? All right. How many of you prefer song number 2? I always appreciate it when there's at least a couple who like song number 2, because it's rare. All right. So almost all of you picked song number 1. Just so you know, the reason I chose these 2, so first of all, both of those songs were by the same artist. So the first one, yes. So the second one is a band called Thrice, the second song is more representative of what they typically do. But then their lead singer, a guy named Dustin Kendrew, will often do like these acoustic covers of pop songs and stuff. So they're both the same artist. So I figured like they're kind of equal, obviously, in like their ability to perform musically, because it's the same guy. But the first one, so I guess I'll just ask you, why did you guys prefer the first one, for those of you who did?
It wasn't like scary.
So second one was scary, okay?
Too loud.
Scary, too loud. What else? Anything else you particularly liked about the first one, or is it just like you really don't like the second one?
The second one was just really bad. And it's kind of too early, but.
All right. Okay, so that's kind of what I was expecting you guys to say. It's the pretty typical response. So this is a pretty good demonstration of what I was talking about with arousal level, right? Like the second one is probably putting you in too high of a state of arousal. It's very high energy. There's like screaming at one point, basically. So that's probably putting you in a state of almost like anxiety a little bit, especially if you're not used to that kind of music. Whereas the first one is very like mellow and calm. So it's not putting you in that high state of arousal. Arousal also relates highly, though, to what's called complexity. So the first song was very simple. It's one guy with one guitar playing an acoustic song. It's a very like simple song structure. There's verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, like any other song that you hear on the radio, basically. It's like, maybe 3 chords that he's playing that makes up the entire song. So it's all very simple. The second one is like a full band, so it's not just him, but it's like, him and a couple guitarists and a bassist and a drummer, etc. It's, the vocals are changing. It's going from like a sort of sing-song melody to a more like screaming. There are key changes and things going on there that just make it a lot more complex. And in general, things that have high levels of complexity also elicit high levels of arousal, which again might kind of push you over the edge of, that's too high, I don't like it. One of the interesting things, though, with like music, art, anything that kind of falls in this category, is that complexity will diminish the more times you encounter something. So if you listen to a song over and over again, the complexity of it, or at least the perceived complexity of it, goes down because our brain starts to figure out those patterns, right? It starts to figure out what it should expect. It starts to figure out when the key changes are going to happen, so it becomes less complex over time. So because of that, if you think of like that graph I was showing earlier, we've got kind of a curve. This is our optimal level of arousal or complexity. If something's around this area, we're going to like it. So if you have a song that starts here, so the very first time you listen to it, you love it because it's hitting that sweet spot. If you listen to it over and over and over again, because the complexity goes down, the arousal level will also go down. So that same song will start to fall maybe here or here or here, until eventually you get bored of it. So how many of you have ever had this happen? You have particularly like maybe a pop song that you listen to it once, you love it, so then you just play it on repeat over and over, and then eventually you're sick of it, right? That's because this is happening. But on the other hand, if you have a song like that second one that's more complex, so that was putting you kind of up here. Like there's too much going on, there's screaming, I don't like it. But if you listen to it over and over again, and the complexity goes down, eventually it'll get to like that sweet spot where you will actually start to like that song. So I bet you, if you listen to that song repeatedly, you would eventually enjoy it. And that's true for a lot of like complex music. If you just give it time and try to understand it, then it often ends up becoming more enjoyable than when you first listen to it. And again, that's also true for like visual art, humor, horror movies, anything that elicits like a high level of arousal at first. The more you expose yourself to it, the less aroused and complex it becomes. So it'll eventually get to kind of that area where it's actually preferable. Okay, any questions about motivation so far before we talk about disruptions of motivation? All right. So our next topic, like I said, we're going to talk about 2 ways that motivation can be severely disrupted and some of like the consequences and implications of that. So one form of disruption of motivation is in addiction or substance use disorder. I'm trying to think of like how much detail I want to go into. I might cut this a little shorter than I had planned because we're getting towards the end and I had that activity I was still planning. I don't know if we'll get to it. That's fine. So first of all, I just want to start by talking a little bit about sort of common perceptions of addiction. People often think, like you guys might not think this, hopefully you don't think this, but a lot of people tend to think that addiction is kind of like a disorder of will or even like morals. So some people think that people who suffer from addiction are just, they don't have the will to overcome their addiction, or maybe they're like, not morally capable of doing the right thing. And I would say we often, like as a society, we tend to treat addiction that way. The fact that most people who end up addicted to a substance, they end up in jail or in prison. They're being punished criminally for being addicted. That's one indication that as a society, we tend to treat addiction as this like moral failure. When really what addiction is it's due to this miswiring of areas of the brain that are important for motivation. So I don't have like a diagram, maybe I should have put it up here just like I did with emotions, but a huge part of the brain, or a part of the brain that's really important for motivation, is what sometimes is called like the reward circuitry. So there are areas of the brain that fire dopamine. You probably have heard of dopamine. It's a neurotransmitter that's really important for like reward and pleasure. And that whole circuit is really important for motivating us. And it kind of goes back to what I was talking about with like emotions, right? So if you make a good decision and you do something that's enjoyable, then you're going to have a release of dopamine in these areas of the brain, in the reward circuit, and that is going to cause you to want to do that thing again. Okay? So this reward circuit is a really strong motivator for a lot of our behaviors. It goes back even to like our food choices, right? Every time you eat an Oreo or ice cream or pizza, that is causing dopamine to fire, to be very active in this area of the brain. When you have sex, this area of the brain is also very active. Anything that's pleasurable is going to activate this reward area of the brain. But this area of the brain is kind of more than that. So people always talk about it as the pleasure circuit, but it's also kind of almost like a survival instinct circuit. So anytime we do anything that's increasing our chances of surviving or increasing our chances of reproducing and passing on our genes, that's really what's causing this area to fire. And in someone with addiction, essentially what happens is that area of the brain gets miswired with whatever the addictive substance is, the drug, alcohol, whatever it might be. And so then what happens is the person starts to treat that substance as if it is something that they need to survive. So they will pursue that substance the same way that anyone would pursue shelter or food or water or something that's integral to our survival. And so because of that, they often end up making really bad decisions, right? But they're decisions that start to make sense if you kind of look at it through that lens of they're doing it because their brain thinks they need it to survive. So probably all of you, if you were put in a situation where, like, let's say you were homeless, you were starving, you had zero money, you had zero access to food, and you're out on the street and you see that someone, is sitting at a table at a restaurant outdoors, and they get up to go to the bathroom and they've left like a whole plate of food there. Probably most people in that condition might be motivated to steal that food, right? Even though, our society standards would say that's illegal, that's a bad choice, you might make that choice if you need to do it to survive. Maybe a more kind of extreme example, let's say you are out ice fishing one day and the ice breaks under you, you fall into the water, and you can't get back out. You try to swim out, but you've gotten into an area where the ice is above you, you can't break through, you're literally going to drown. Probably the worst thing you could do in that moment is to take a breath, right? Because if you breathe in, your lungs are going to fill with water, you're going to drown, you're going to die. But your survival instinct is going to kick in, and it's going to be screaming, I need air, I need oxygen to survive. And so in that moment, you're probably going to take a breath, breathe in the water, which would be the worst decision possible, right? See a lot of grim faces, but I want you to just imagine someone with addiction, that is essentially how they feel. They feel like, I need a breath of air to survive. I need to steal this food, or else I'm going to starve to death and die. That same feeling then gets applied to the cocaine, the alcohol, whatever substance it might be that they're addicted to. So if you think of it that way, all their decisions start to make sense, right? All the kind of like irrational things that people do to keep their addiction going starts to make a lot of sense. And again, it's due to miswiring of this area of the brain that's very important for motivating a lot of our behaviors. People with addiction, so some of the things that increase risk of addiction, one is a genetic predisposition. So there's some evidence that people who become addicted, they have a mutation in the genes that code for those dopamine neurons and receptors that are involved in that whole area of the brain I was just talking about. They also, that genetic predisposition often will give people who are addicts like a higher tolerance for whatever substance they're addicted to. So someone who's an alcoholic, for example, often has a genetic predisposition to have a high tolerance of alcohol, so they can drink more of it and not get like the negative effects that most people would get, right? Like me, I would take 2 or 3 beers or whatever, I might be vomiting at that point because I have very low tolerance. Someone who has a higher tolerance might be able to drink 10, 12 beers and not have any effect. So then they're more likely to drink more of the substance because it's not having a negative impact. So they don't have that like negative punishment motivator to stop them from drinking, the same way that a lot of people do. So one of the risk factors is genetic predisposition. Another is early and repeated exposure. So someone who has lots of access to drugs or alcohol in their childhood is going to be more likely to become addicted. And then there are also certain personality traits. People who are impulsive or sensation-seeking are also more likely to develop an addiction later on. Okay. Another potential disruption of motivation is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. So part of the system that helps motivate us, especially towards long-term goals, is what's called executive function. Executive function is essentially our ability to self-regulate and self-monitor. So it's our ability, for example, to focus our attention on what we want to focus on what is a high priority. So, right now you're maybe taking this class and 2 or 3 other classes or whatever. You want to focus your attention on studying instead of playing video games. Your ability to do that would be one example of executive function. It's also our ability to plan ahead and to organize and to set goals and pursue those goals. Executive function also involves a little bit of like emotional regulation. So being able to regulate our emotions and express them appropriately. And all that's really important for motivating our behavior, right? If you want to get a degree, you want to buy a house, executive function is going to be really important for setting those goals, regulating our behaviors, focusing our attention on what's important so that we can achieve those goals. So people with ADHD often have disorder of those executive functions. So they have inability to control attention. Instead of them controlling their own attention, often their attention is controlled by things external to them. So they may want to sit down and study, but their attention will drift to other things that are maybe more fun or maybe more pleasurable in the short term, playing video games, watching Netflix, whatever it might be. Once they do, sit down and force themselves to study, they have a hard time maintaining their attention as well. So their attention might be distracted by all those things I just mentioned. They also tend to have decreased emotional regulation and inhibition. So they may sort of lash out their emotions more than other people. They may have difficulty inhibiting like certain thoughts and behaviors. So if someone with ADHD is in a conversation with someone else, they may interrupt that person frequently, not because they're trying to be rude, but just because like they have a thought that pops in their head and they're not good at inhibiting that or stopping themselves from saying whatever it is that comes to their mind. They also tend to have impaired working memory. So remember, working memory we talked about a couple weeks ago. That's your ability to temporarily like manipulate information to accomplish a task. They often have impairments in that as well. So like we did a couple tasks where we measured your memory capacity, like that digit span thing, where I listed out a bunch of numbers and had you write them down. Kind of the average span is about 7. Someone with ADHD, they may have a working memory span of like 5 or less than that. So their working memory is impaired as well. There's some evidence that ADHD is due to irregularities in certain areas of the brain. So the prefrontal cortex is really important for a lot of those executive functions I was just talking about. So people with ADHD tend to have less connectivity and less activity in that area of the brain. They also, kind of similar to addiction in some ways, they have some disruptions in the dopamine system as well. And there actually tends to be some overlap between ADHD and addiction. So people who have ADHD are more likely to have a substance use disorder compared to someone who does not have ADHD. And that might be due to this shared thing where they have disruptions in the dopamine system. Norepinephrine as well. Norepinephrine is basically like adrenaline. It's the neurotransmitter that helps with our overall state of arousal, so that makes us alert and awake. And so people with ADHD have disruptions in that neurotransmitter system as well. The most common form of treatment for ADHD are stimulant medications. And actually these medications, they're chemically very similar to like methamphetamines, which sometimes surprises people. I would say like if that shocks you or worries you, I would say like caffeine is also chemically very similar to like cocaine and amphetamines and stimulants. It is a stimulant. So, things like Ritalin and Adderall are also very similar to caffeine in a lot of ways. So those stimulant medications, essentially what they do is they help increase activity in this prefrontal cortex. So they make that area of the brain more active so that it's better able to do all those executive functions I talked about earlier. Cognitive behavioral therapy is basically a type of therapy where the person learns to identify like their thought patterns, identify unhealthy thought patterns, and replace those with things that are more healthy and productive. It teaches people to identify some of those behaviors, like if their mind is wandering, if they're sitting down trying to study and their attention starts to wander, cognitive behavioral therapy would basically teach them to identify the moment that happens and try to figure out like what triggers are causing your attention to drift. Are there ways to maybe change up the environment, like let's put the video games in a different room from where we study so that those aren't drawing your attention away, etc. Cognitive behavioral therapy can be just as effective as medications in treating ADHD. So just kind of to conclude, addiction and ADHD both can be thought of as kind of disruptions in the parts of the brain that are important for motivation. Any questions about motivation?